Today we're talking about developments and the rise of the pollsters in the 1930s. While the academic and government worlds saw a rise of standardized questionnaires and the beginnings of probability sampling in the 1930s, a new line of development rose from a different community altogether. The 1930s saw the first appearance of pollsters doing national samples and claiming scientific support for their work. These new pollsters, most notably Elmo Roper and George Gallup, provided newspapers with horse race polling for the 1936 election and polls of public opinion on a variety of issues between elections. Where did they come from, and what was their influence? The roots of the pollsters come from a different direction than the ones we've talked about before. The pollsters were much more rooted in market research and in journalism's tradition of straw polls. The pollsters grew up in market research for the most part on the one side and journalism on the other. Market research as a business and to a lesser degree as an academic discipline began to develop in the as early as the 1890s. Harlow Gale, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota, used questionnaires to study reaction to advertising in 1895. But significant development in the field really took place in the decade of the 1910s to 1920s, especially in magazine publishing and newspapers and some industrial firms. For example, Curtis Publishing, the publisher of the Saturday Evening Post, the Ladies' Home Journal, and Gentleman Farmer, appointed a director of research in 1911. His name was Charles Coolidge Parlin, and among other things, he offered advice to automobile manufacturers, pointing out that car production had grown by 2,000%, from 20,000 to 400,000 per year, and that this meant that cars and car manufacturers had to appeal to repeat buyers who had discretion rather than going to people who were buying their first car, or their only car for that matter. This encouraged car makers to ask consumers what they wanted and to feed that information back into the design process as well as into subsequent advertising. At about this same time, the Harvard Graduate School of Business established a Bureau of Business Research in 1911 and developed some of the academic approaches to the psychological aspects of markets and consumer research. Harvard researchers also contributed to some of the early work on randomized probability sampling as applied to market research. Newspapers in this period also conducted reader surveys. For example, starting in 1922, the Milwaukee Journal conducted an annual study of consumer purchases, selecting every third household in a canvas of Milwaukee. By the early 1930s, this sort of business research was growing, ironically in response to the Depression's pressure on business to make products better and to market them better. The methodology of early market research focused heavily on purposive samples, drawn by judgment rather than probability, or canvases of areas, as with the Milwaukee Journal example. They also introduced a term that persists to today, panels. Panels in the period of the 1930s were purposively selected groups of consumers, often with special interest in a topic, such as automobiles. Using a combination of interview methods, both formal and informal, market researchers used these panels to gain insight into their product and consumer responses. While often quite large in number, you can see the resemblance between the 1930s panel and the modern focus group. Focus groups are rarely randomly selected, but instead are usually recruited from an involved population, such as, for example, parents of diaper-aged children. The interview technique is usually informal and subjective rather than structured and using standardized questioning, and the goal, though, remains the same as it was in the teens, 20s, and 30s with their panels. Insight into how people are reacting to a product based on the totality of their responses rather than responses to structured questions, and likewise little or no pretense to being nationally representative in any probabilistic sense. For some purposes, market researchers used far larger samples, often based on quotas of some demographic characteristics. So, for example, the J. Walter Thompson advertising firm, which was a pioneer in market research and hired many of the early market research professionals, instructed interviewers to select respondents according to specified percentages, using an A, B, C, and D system of rating the socioeconomic status. For example, A was homes of substantial wealth with at least one servant. Class B, comfortable middle-class homes personally directed by intelligent women. Class 3, industrial homes of skilled mechanics or petty tradespeople with no servants. And D, homes of unskilled laborers, or in foreign districts where it is difficult for American ways to penetrate. With those categories, the J. Walter Thompson interviewers could go and allocate their quotas to so many from Class A, so many to Class B, and so on. The geographic coverage of these early studies was varied and seldom national, but the quota system was an explicit attempt to provide a representative sample. Another development in this period was standardizing the questionnaire. There was considerable variation in market research in particular, with a lot of stress on subjective synthesis of responses rather than specific structured interviews. Part of this led to a long-running and still occasional debate between open and closed questions. Much of the market research relied on open-ended questions that were then coded into categories of response. But many of those coding categories was without an organizing scheme or conception of what types of responses fit in what categories, without an overarching scheme or theory, if you will, of consumer responses. These open-ended responses tended to produce long lists of adjectives or descriptions, but not very much that was analytically useful. On the other hand, proponents of open-ended responses believed that by letting the respondents say whatever was at the top of their head, whatever they were thinking about, gave the researcher a better understanding of those considerations, even if they were buried in a mass of comments requiring synthesis. But that difficulty of understanding led to an alternative of closed-ended standardized responses. We've seen that already in some of the work in the psychologists were producing in academics, but in the market research field, this was still a wide open debate between the closed and open-ended responses. Some of the closed-ended responses did produce innovations, some of which persist. For example, as early as 1925, the one organization used a so-called thermometer test that rated reactions to, among other things, magazines by an analogy to a thermometer. The thermometer had specific categories labeled as, for example, blood heat at 98 degrees, and that was equal to indispensable. Summer heat at 70 degrees, necessary. Normal, 60 degrees, was considered interesting, and above freezing at 40 degrees, mild interest in the magazine. I have to say that for those of us that grew up in the South in the summertime, summer heat of 70 degrees seems remarkably cool. The thermometer still lives on in, among other places, the American National Election Study that continues to ask respondents to rate candidates and social groups on a feeling thermometer, where 0 means very cold and 100 means very warm or favorable, with explicitly 50 as neutral, where you don't feel much one way or the other.